Hello listeners and welcome to this week's episode of the Cult Vault. I'm your speaker Casey, and this week we are going to be covering a new group on the show. But before we get stuck in, I just wanted to go through some usual business. If you are someone interested in true crime or the true crime community, then you have to try and come to CrimeCon UK in London on June the 11th and 12th of this year. There will be private investigators, forensic workshops, police dogs, documentary makers, retired detectives speaking about their cases. There are even VIP dinners where you can get involved in some true crime activities, and a whole host of awesome podcasts on site where you can meet and greet the hosts, including me. I will also be doing a live interview with a cult survivor at the event, and I would love for you to come and say hi, spend some time and grab a drink at the bar. For tickets, visit crimecon.co.uk and use the code CULT at the checkout for a discount on your ticket. If you would like to support the podcast, I have a Patreon account at patreon.com/thecultvault, and you can support me from as little as £1 a month. Every pledge allows me to continue going month to month with the podcast. You can also donate at redcircle.com/thecultvault or follow the links in the episode description to find all of the ways you can help the show. I have a merch store and the Ally Awards are still running at cultvaultpodcast.com, and my website also includes a load of survivor resources. Lastly, for a chance to win a copy of this month's monthly memoir in the #monthly memoir giveaway, follow, like and comment on my social media posts at cultvaultpod, where I am running a giveaway for Vinnie Kocius and her book, Cult Child, an in-depth look into the experiences of Vinnie and her childhood growing up in Sam Fythe's Move of God. Now, with all that aside, here is Sarah. So hello, Sarah, and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me today and for agreeing to chat with me about a new topic on the podcast. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Sure. Also, thank you for having me here today. It's really awesome to be able to talk to you after listening to all the other episodes I've heard so far. As a fellow cult, like being interested in cults and all that stuff, like it's really cool. So my name is Sarah Kirku. I live in Oxford, Pennsylvania. So that's the southeastern part of PA, close to Maryland and Delaware. So I'm in Amish country. I'm married. I have 3 kids. I'm half scatterbrained most days. But I'm not currently working in my field, but I have in the past. And I will continue at some point in the future when all of my kids are in school. I have a youngest who won't be in school for a while. But I have a master's degree or an MA in early American history or U.S. history. And I also have a bachelor's or a BA in anthropology and archaeology with minors in Latin American and Native American studies from Westchester University of Pennsylvania. I worked in the field of history in the museum setting as a historic guide and an interpreter. So I would dress up in like colonial garb, and most people would like see me at the local Wawa, which is like a convenience like store around here. And they'd be like, "Are you Amish?" Well, they would know around here that I'm not Amish, but some people would get confused and be like, because I'd go and stop for a drink and then I'd go to work wearing like colonial clothing. I basically studied and interpreted Revolutionary War history, but I've been interested in studying cults and cult activity for a really long time, just on my own. And I thought this would be a particular topic of interest for you. That's why I had mentioned it to you, because it's one of those fringy groups that unless somebody tells you, you wouldn't have really heard of them, or maybe you would at some point. But that's a little bit about me. I don't know if there's much more.
You say that like that's not much. That's a pretty lengthy introduction. I'm really
sorry.
Please don't apologize. I'd love to know how you became interested in early history, and if there was something that sparked your passion for learning about that particular subject matter.
Oh, like early American history?
Yeah.
Okay. So when I was younger, when I was really young, I'd say probably 4 or 5 years old, my grandfather, my mom's father, would take the entire family on like trips through the weekend, like Friday through Sunday. We would go to Washington, D.C. every once in a while, like in the spring, summer, or fall, and we'd go to New York City, because I used to live in New Jersey. So we were like not too far away to drive for a few hours to each place. And we would go to like the Smithsonian, we would go to the Natural History Museum or Museum of Natural History. We went to Washington, D.C. and went to like a bunch of museums there. And then we would go on vacations, and we went out west to the Western United States, which is really where like my interest in early American, but more frontier, like Wild West history came from. So that's what I really wish that I was doing right now, working in the field of that Western expansion, because we would go out and we'd go to like ghost towns where like there's nobody there, and they weren't touristy ones. They were like literally in the middle of nowhere. We'd go camping out there, and we would just go to a lot of like museums and national parks and state parks and stuff. And I think from such an early age, and then learning about different cultures and different people's like way of living, it just was really fascinating to me. And so that's, I think, pretty much what sparked that interest. And I just kind of kept at it until now, you know.
That's so interesting that it stuck with you and nurtured your passion for getting a master's degree in that field. That's a huge accomplishment in itself. And the archaeology and anthropology side of things as well, that's significantly different to the studies of early American history. So is that something that you also had like a co-interest in growing up, or something that developed as you researched the history of America a bit more?
Well, I would say that I went to college for anthropology and archaeology first. So history just came afterwards, and that I continued on with that because of life circumstance and just knowing that I probably, with a family that I have and like having to travel and all that, archaeology wouldn't have worked for me just in my situation, even though I wish that I could be doing it. And actually, so I would have done historical archaeology, which is like you're not studying prehistory, where you're studying like let's say, and I say prehistory like written history, so you're not like looking at like Neolithic man or whatever, and you're like trying to find stuff on that. Like I would be more into like finding pipe stems in front of an old tavern and doing digs like, you know, from probably like the 1700s on, or there's earlier history than that, but within the sphere of like American history, because that's what always drew my interest. A lot of people are like, oh, I love Egypt, and that's the kind of archaeology I want to do, but I was never drawn to it in that way. I love like just the story of like American history and how like weirdly it came to be, you know, but then like you can dig up things and find things about it too. And I like material, like I'm not a materialist myself, but I like material culture and like material history and finding those things that people used. And you're like, what was this for? Wow, like they were so clever, and knowing that they can use this for a particular thing, but it grew into something different. And now we have like a refrigerator or a, you know, like, I don't know.
Is there anything you remember specifically finding yourself, or a dig that you've been involved in, where you had one of them moments and you were like, oh my goodness, what is this?
Yeah. Well, we didn't really find anything like super weird, but when I was in college, because I did digs when I was in college, I didn't really get to do them after college because I didn't work in a field where I was able to do that. But we did one, I'm trying to remember the name of the place now because it's been quite a while. We found the foundation to like a building, and we were trying to figure out what this foundation was for, and we found out it was like a grist mill, and we were finding like all this like these chunks of weird looking blobby like metal stuff. it's called slag. I mean, we just found tons of slag and like metal and nails. And that was, to me, that was like interesting because we were just finding like nails and broken glass. And we found buttons, and we found like a tiny, like little old, like a faucet type thing that went to like an old sink from like the 1800s. And I don't remember the name of the place. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the place.
So you think the stuff that you found was from around about the 1800s?
1800s about, yeah. And it was used, so there was a grist mill, and then like right around it was a school for freed Black children that started up in the 1800s too, but I cannot remember. I think it was called Pine Forge Academy in Pottstown, PA. I think that's what it was called. But yeah, we didn't find it. We found like a lot of like animal bones, and like we found a humongous like jawbone to like a horse, and like we found all sorts of like crazy weird stuff, but we didn't find any like, projectile points or like Native American stuff. We found a lot of more recent American cultural historic stuff.
Right.
So,
have you ever found a grave?
I have not. Not me, no. But actually my professor did, and she would have to, anytime they ever, because she actually worked doing Mesoamerican archaeology, and she did archaeology down in Central and South America, and they would find, like, she worked on digs there, and she found remains, like human remains, and they would have to report it. And I think it's the same in America, like no matter where you go, you have to report it to whatever authorities are there that would look at that, and forensics, and you'd have like forensic archaeologists working on this stuff, and it's a different type of field. I don't know if I'd want to, but there are people that are dedicated to just that study of archaeology too, is just finding like human remains and stuff. So
I suppose somebody that's familiar with that field would be able to look at that type of scenario and say whether that was a natural grave that somebody had been placed into as part of the passing away ceremony, as opposed to something a bit more nefarious, like somebody had been buried there after being killed. Which is kind of interesting to know that people can just look at that and say that it's kind of one or the other. But I mean, I could ask you questions about this all day because I'm genuinely really interested. But we're going to be talking about a strange group that has come up in the media a little bit more so than usual recently because of some strange things that happened in one of the areas where one of the group's communes is based, and there was questions around whether the group was involved in what actually happened, and we'll talk all about that as we go. But your interest in cults specifically, do you think that comes from your passion for learning about history and historical events?
Sort of. So I wouldn't say I was in a cult. I'm not going to say that. But so this group grew out of a movement, which I could give you the history of in a minute. But so they grew out of a movement in the 1970s called the Jesus movement. I don't know if you're familiar with that at all. Yes. Okay. So like a bunch of hippies are finding Jesus, and they're, trying to be countercultural. And we belonged to, and I say we, my husband and I belonged to a church called Calvary Chapel. And I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're all around the United States. They're like everywhere now. So they're called Calvary Chapel. Maybe we could talk about them another time. But they grew out of this movement. So that this group that I'm going to, do you want me to say the name of who they are yet or no?
Well, it's going to be on the episode title.
Okay.
So anybody that's going to listen to the episode will know by that point. But it's entirely up to you.
Okay, so the 12 tribes. Okay, so they're called the 12 tribes, or the 12 tribes community, as they like to be called, or how I was introduced to them was the 12 tribes of Israel Commonwealth. That's what they used to be called, but then they had names before that. But they grew out of this Jesus movement. And a lot of other groups did too. And the Calvary Chapel group that we belonged to, which was just like going to church for me. Like it wasn't like any different than going to church, except for they had drums and guitars and a stage, and they played like all different kinds of music, and it was just kind of cool. They had a like coffee shop, and so to us it was kind of like a pretty cool place to be. And we were a part of that church for a long time. And I think my own just like upbringing with religion in general gravitated me towards like wanting to know more, because even before, so I was part of Calvary Chapel for a short while, and that's just a whole other story. And then I kind of went away from them, and then I was interested in like, I've always loved like Indian culture and stuff. So, and I loved Hinduism, so I would study that, and I liked their philosophies and the way that they believed in like the afterlife, or if we come back. It was just always fascinating to me. So, but I also like the history of where these groups start too. So when I say they came out of the Jesus movement, it's like that's where it started. That's the history, and then it kind of branches out from there. And they're starting to make this own like new piece of history, and it's just really fascinating. So I think just my background with my religious stuff brought me to kind of being interested in this group when I found out about them.
And the 12 tribes have communes in different parts of America and the world, is that right?
Yeah, so they have, okay, so since the 80s and 90s, they're now in different states in the United States. So Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, Massachusetts, New York, Kansas, Colorado. I mean, it might as well just be in the 50 states at this point. California, Washington, New Hampshire, Vermont, and they are in other countries. So they're in Canada, Australia, they're in the United Kingdom, Brazil, Spain, Germany, Argentina, France, Czech Republic, and Japan. I don't know if I'm missing any. Hopefully I'm not. But that's as many that I don't know if they're in New Zealand. Maybe I know that they're in Australia too.
Right. And my understanding of this particular group is that they expanded pretty quickly in terms of their initial existence in the world up to where they exist around the world, and the amount of communes that they have. So is there any history that you can give us on the group, any rough or exact dates or anything in your research that you were able to find around leadership, and if they kind of have changed leadership roles and all of that stuff that we love to start with?
Okay. Yeah. So they were this 12 tribes movement can be traced back to a ministry or like a Bible study of teenagers called the Light Brigade in 1972 in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So there was a man by the name of Eugene Spriggs. Some people just call him Gene Spriggs. He's no longer alive. Or his new name when he came into the community as a new person, and he was like the head of everything. It was Yoneq, Yoneq. I think that's how you spell it. And his wife, Marcia. So Gene and Marcia Spriggs, they operated this ministry that they had out of a coffee shop called the Lighthouse. And they opened several cafe/restaurants called the Yellow Deli. So if you do searches on them, you'll find them like all over the place. And they began like living communally. So it started out as they would like recruit teenagers or young people or people that looked like they were seeking something. I don't know how they would find that out, but they were seeking something. So they would go to like local schools, like popular hangout spots. They would eventually come to get a bus. I don't remember what the buses had, like a name. I know they have a ship called the Peacemaker, and they have a ship. I don't know. And they have like a bus, but I don't remember if the bus had a name or not. But it was like a school bus that they transformed into their bus that they would drive around, and they would park out in front of like concerts and stuff. And if people were hurt, they would offer like free medical help and that kind of thing. And that's how they would sort of recruit individuals. So a lot of times it was younger people. And they were part, like this Light Brigade group was a part of the First Presbyterian Church in their town. And while they were at the First Presbyterian Church, on January 12th in 1975, it's known that they were going to Eugene Spriggs and some people were going to church on that day, or a Bible study or whatever. And there was a note on the door that said that the service was canceled for the Super Bowl, which is like a humongous deal in the United States. The Super Bowl is like, it might as well be its own holiday, you know? But for this group of people that were starting this new communal way of like being, especially Eugene Spriggs, he didn't like that, because that was of the world. It was not of what the kingdom of God and what Jesus wanted you to be doing. And so they saw this and all other churches as like as sinful and not worthy to even say that they believe in God. Like, they're fallen, we need to start something new. And so they formed the Vine Christian Community Church. And then with this church, they started planting other churches around. So they would be planting churches all over the place. Like, they had a few in Georgia and Alabama and in Tennessee. And the 12 tribes eventually came to be. It grew out of a Bible study group in Chattanooga, Tennessee in 1972. And a little bit about the leader. Eugene Spriggs was a guidance counselor and a former high school teacher. And Marcia was his fourth wife. I don't know who his other wives were. I don't think I've ever found them in like any of my research. But they started gathering more and more people through this 12 tribes. And yeah, they just preached from the Jesus movement that Jesus was this countercultural guy and we should be following him. This is radical. This is different. He believes that all, like there's an order to everything, and there was another, a little bit of controversy too, which I could go about later, in regards to race. And, but that I don't think came until later. Their group originally just like accepted pretty much everybody. So women, men were allowed to get to be together in the same room. They kind of dressed like hippies, like black and white could be together. Where at this time in the 70s, you have a lot of the civil rights movements going on. You have a lot of feminist movements going on. You have all of these things that are already countercultural, but yet they're still saying that, we could still come together and be of God and be one people, regardless of race or sex or age or class. So that's kind of a little bit of the history behind them. And also, really quick, a lot of people get the 12 tribes confused. So if anybody were to look this up online with the Black Hebrew Israelite movement, like the ISUPK, you did, some on that. But they're not related at all. They're completely different. Like, these are just like 12 tribes communities are like white hippie people. They look like they're straight out of the 1970s. So they're not all white people, but they do have some Black members. But like I said, I could talk about the racial aspect of it in a little while. So,
and some of the footage that I've watched of the 12 tribes that people have managed to record looks like it's taken straight out of the film Midsummer, if anybody's watched that.
Yes.
And it's really strange because I think, and this is kind of going to be a lot of me trying to articulate my thoughts, but I feel like when people who aren't educated on cults or aware of cult-like methods of control, when they hear that word, they may jump straight to films like Midsummer or incorrect events from history and things that never really happened, like satanic ritualistic abuse and the satanic panic of the 80s. And depictions of what cults and the occult might look like through media, salacious headlines, films and TV and things like Midsummer. So I went to watch some insider footage on YouTube of ceremonies that people have recorded inside the communes of the 12 tribes. And I thought that I was watching Midsummer.
Yeah.
I said to my partner, this is that film we watched. And he was like, which film? And I was like, Midsummer, that really strange film. And he was like, no, the quality of this video recording is not good enough to be that film. You know, that film was in HD and it was professionally recorded. This isn't that. But I was so surprised at the similarities in the headdresses, in the clothing, in the bonnets over the women's heads and the length of the men's hair. So I don't know if you went and watched any of that. I mean, you said that you grew up around the 12 tribes, so you've probably actually seen some of the dress in real life. I was just so surprised by the similarities.
Yeah. Oh, well, I didn't grow up around the 12 tribes. I actually found out about them. So the Calvary Chapel movement that I was part of it wasn't the same. It's kind of funny how from that Jesus movement, there were different, like, varying effects of that movement on individuals who go off and like make their own thing. So I unfortunately, in quotes, did not become a part of that group and get to see what they were like. But no, I mean, I haven't seen them in person, but I have seen a lot of documentary type or just recordings, like film of these people and how they dress and what they look like. And I actually did get an opportunity to talk to someone on the phone at one point many years ago, because I did want to visit a community and I did want to do like research on them while I was in college. And my husband was like, I don't really know if you should do that. That might be not a good idea. You might get stuck there forever. And I'm like, no, I won't. I never got a chance to, because they were just really far from where I was. And I'd have to spend like a couple days there to make it worth my while. And I was just kind of a little reluctant. So I'm like, I'll just talk to somebody on the phone. But their dress is what makes them look a little bit different. Like they stand out a little bit, you know, from a crowd. But if they were at like a Grateful Dead concert or something, they might not look, or like a Fish concert, they might not look that different. You know, they're they have like hippie vibes, you know. But I could see that from Midsummer, because I have seen Midsummer. I could see that as something that would seem like, I mean, I consider them a cult. I'm not gonna downplay it. And you know, there are people that can argue that, like, and it is true, like all religious movements are considered cults. It just, are you looking at it from cult in a negative perspective where they're damaging people and families and people's mental health and their livelihood? Or are they just like a cult following, like you would find like a cult classic movie and everybody follows this movie, but it's not like it's a cult classic movie. It's not damaging anybody if you're just a part of your regular Presbyterian church, and it makes you feel great every week that you go to it, but you can live a normal life and be able to do things. So I think it depends on how you look at cult. From this perspective, I think this is a very damaging cult to people. So,
and if people don't like to use that label because of some of the reasons that you've mentioned there, then high demand religious group is certainly one way to describe the methods that are used within the 12 tribes, which we know about because of ex-members coming forward to share their stories, their testimonies, elders that have left the 12 tribes to come forward and share information, people that have managed to, I say in air quotes, infiltrate the group to make journalistic reports and bring insider information out into the public eye. And during your research, you sent me a whole host of sources and resources that you've used for our discussion today, which I will include in the episode description if anybody wants to go and sort of corroborate the information that we're talking about today, because we're coming at it from more of a research perspective rather than a lived experience perspective, like we usually do with survivors that we interview on the show. So if anybody is feeling a little skeptical of Sarah's research today, or if anybody wants to kind of further their knowledge and build on what Sarah presents for us today, then we will make sure that we get those sources listed. But something that I thought about when you mentioned the 1970s and the counterculture is that whole satanic panic, mass hysteria that happened in the 80s kind of really started to ramp up during the 60s with the feminist movement and women having access to birth control and music really starting to reflect the discontent that young adults were feeling in that part of the world during that time, with the Vietnam War, with Richard Nixon, and the access to hallucinogenic drugs like LSD, and young people leaving home and kind of not so much rejecting religion, but being open-minded around spirituality and just kind of not staying in one place, very free-flowing, hitchhiking from town to town and state to state, and following their favorite band around, or pursuing further education in a way that they may not have done before, especially women, and kind of multiple partners and the free love movement, and everybody having flowers in their hair, and Haight-Ashbury being sort of the face in San Francisco of this and the height of this counterculture movement. And it was such a fast and hard decade in the 60s. It was like all this pent up repression that was suddenly lifted through this bohemian stand against those things, almost burnt out at the end of the 60s. So by the time the early 70s came, there's this huge evangelical push, and almost extremist and fringe evangelical groups and televangelists, and women start to wear long dresses again, with long sleeves and buttons up to the neck, and it's almost like religion falls back into favor with a lot of the American population, from what we can see in studies that have been done around the counterculture in the 60s and 70s. So by the time, and I guess from that, the Jesus movement was born. So people are like, I have really kind of enveloped myself in the 60s, and I'm not ready to leave all of that behind, but I do want to keep Jesus with me, or I do want to build my relationship with my faith. And so to have those two things together, you have this Jesus movement. And from that, in 1972, you've got this group of very motivated individuals led by Eugene Spriggs, who decide that they're going to take their message and their core beliefs and their correct way of practicing their Presbyterian Protestant belief systems, and they're going to spread that throughout America. So they are very clever in how they do that. You mentioned the Yellow Deli, which is a chain that started off as one and has since given birth to a whole host of delis throughout America. And maybe people have eaten there and not even realized, but it's kind of like a first stage of conversion when you visit a Yellow Deli, because the food is cheap, but it's supposed to be really tasty. And the delis are open 24 hours a day. So if you find yourself hungry with nowhere to go and you're looking for a good meal at 3-4 in the morning, or somebody finds you on the street a little worse for wear and they're like, hey, I know where we can get some really good food, and you go to the Yellow Deli, and the staff that are there, or the volunteers that are there, are very well versed in proselytizing and asking you questions about yourself and how that would work in the way that the 12 tribes perceive the world and how they practice their religion. And so that's kind of where we are. And you've given us such a fantastic history and introduction. And I thought it was just interesting to link those two things together about the 60s and then the birth of the 12 tribes in the early 70s, and how that's managed to build on and on and on and on up until where we are today in 2022. But what was really interesting is how you mentioned the rejection of worldly things and secular ideas and beliefs, but following bands around to find discontented young people who like to go to concerts and then ask them if there's anything missing in their lives and if the 12 tribes can help them find what that is that's missing, is very secular. That's a very secular thing to do, to follow bands around, I feel like. And also to the branding that they use is very much flowers in your hair, Austin Powers kind of vibes. And that, I feel like that too is also quite secular.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like it. And it's just funny because when I found out about them, maybe I could tell you a little bit about this, because I found out about this group when I worked for a health food store. Like in 2007, I worked for a health food store and we got a shipment in of Yerba Mate Tea. I don't know if you're familiar with what Yerba Mate is or if you drink a lot of tea, but okay. So Yerba Mate it was a pre-European, it was cultivated, it's pre-European colonization in an area which is now known as Paraguay, in South America. And it was used as a drink, but it became and it's caffeinated. And it's just drunk as like a regular tea. You can either get it in like a packet or a sachet, or you can get it loose leaf. And we got a shipment of this in. And I like drinking tea, and I was just into whatever was kind of like, we would get new boxes in. I'm like, oh, that's cool. What is that? And it said the mate factor on the label. It was like a really cool box. And I was like, and it said organic yerba mate tea. And I was like, I don't even know what that is. And a coworker / friend who I worked with was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we're getting this tea here. I actually know where that place is. It was like the Mate Factor, I think, was a restaurant or a deli in Ithaca, New York, or around that area, because she went to college there. And she's like, oh yeah, they're like a cult. And I was like, oh, okay. She said, yeah, they have like their own businesses, and they like they proselytize to all the like college kids that are coming out of class. Like they'll be walking on the sidewalk, down just like minding their own business. And these people will just be like handing them pamphlets, and which they call free papers, which you can get for free on their website digitally, or you can actually contact them to order them like for free. They'll ship them to you for free. They're like newspaper material. It kind of reminds me of, and I'm not comparing these two in any way, like religion wise. I'm just by the product. I would say it reminds me of a watchtower from like the Jehovah's Witnesses, because
it's certainly their version of propaganda. Absolutely, yeah. Especially if you go to look at them online, and the some of the wording is similar to something that you might see in Watchtower. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, and because that's the way that because like a lot of Christian groups will use tracts or like these little tiny pamphlets, and you might find them here or there. Somebody might hand you one. I don't know. That happens a lot in our area because we live near the Amish and Mennonites, and so we have a largely religious community around us. But people will like hand out that stuff. Their free papers are kind of used in that same way. But they're more of like a zine or like a magazine, kind of like, but I just compare it to the Watchtower in like the type of print that it is, form, for anybody that's familiar with what a Watchtower looks like, if you've ever gotten one in the mail. Or so that's sort of what their free papers are like. And they kind of use that along with biblical like literature or biblical, or even just the Bible, because they're not really allowed to read anything else besides the Bible or their free papers. So you'll have them using that along with their Bible to tell you the right way to live and whatever, and their ideas on society and how things should be, and people that are following after like even just the regular church. Like if you wear a cross, you might as well be wearing, I saw this in one of their free papers, you might as well be wearing an electric chair as a necklace, because the cross symbolizes the most excruciating, painful thing that Christ ever had to endure. Why would you want to wear that around your neck as a piece of jewelry? You might as well be wearing an electric chair. And I'm like, oh my gosh, no, I can't believe that they actually like put that in there. But there are a lot of things within, and like, your listeners can go and look at these things right on their website. It's just 12tribes.org, I think. And they can look at these free papers for themselves because they're all digital, and it makes it easily accessible. And they have like videos on their website too. But they would just proselytize, like, and they would just hand out this literature and stuff. But she also said that they ran organic farms, and that's where this tea comes from, or they do contract work with other companies in order to be able to give work to people within their community, and produce things that work with other companies, and that's how they raise their money for the community and stuff. But they live communally, so they live on like I don't know, they're like 10 families living in one house, and they work on this huge farm. So I was like, wow, that's really interesting. So that's how I found out about them. And I had never heard of them before, and not realizing like they have been around for a really long time in my eyes, because, some movements might start and then they kind of fizzle out. And this one just kind of sort of steadily grows, not like in big, huge amounts, but they have about 3,000 to 4,000 members worldwide. And doesn't seem like a lot, but it sort of is. To me, it's a substantial number. So.
And a lot of the preaching that comes out of the 12 tribes, or some of the core messages that the movement teaches, has a lot to do with the number of followers that they have, or the number of people that they need to reach with their work in order to reach the next stage of their work, which I'm sure we'll talk about as we go on. From my understanding from some of the research that I have done, which I don't think is in depth as the amount that you have been able to do, but you mentioned the communes there. So Eugene Spriggs, he lives with his fourth wife, and they have a few friends, and they kind of move on to this farm. And then the families grow, and then there's a few of them, and then, as you said, they expand throughout the country and then throughout the world. Do you know where the very first commune was established? Was it in the same area that the Light Brigade was functioning in before it turned into the Vine Christian Community Church, or was the Vine Community Christian Church the first established commune?
I don't remember if it was the first established commune, and I'm not sure if the first, it might have been, and it was in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I know that was like the first area that they kind of grew out from, but I don't remember if I know that it was just their Bible study group, and they started off where, like, within their business or their like coffee shop that they owned, they would allow people to come in. A lot of them were like younger teenage, like boys, or just anybody who really wanted to come in, and they could stay the night. They could stay 2 nights. You could stay here for as long as you want, and then it kind of just grew out of that. I don't know if they were really originally thinking of starting a commune. I think the intentions of the beginning of this were pure ones. They weren't like, I'm going to become the head of this, I don't even know if they really like to call themselves a church. They like calling themselves a community, and I think it started off with them wanting to just have a wholesome place, because there was just so much craziness going on in their world that even when they showed up for church, for their church service at that Presbyterian church that day, and they noticed that even these people who are supposed to be following God, now they're following a worldly thing like the Super Bowl and not giving honor to God. They're not even here for what they're supposed to be. And they're out in the world following some secular like thing that God wants nothing to do with. He'd rather you be in church. So we're splitting from this because this is not what God wants from us. And they wanted to be wholesome and kind of just follow after that religious belief that they had, to be pure and follow through with God's commandments. And I think out of that, it ended up trailing into other things that eventually allowed them, the original people that followed this belief of their own and then passed it on to others. And then the elders worked with other elders within the church who were men, because women have no say in any of the stuff that goes on in the church, which unfortunately seems like a common theme with a lot of these groups, especially Christian groups. But they made like the decisions on how children should be educated, how they should be raised, how they should. So eventually they started not allowing their children to go to public school. And so they would teach them at home, and they would do like their homeschooling or community schooling. Like you would see like within Amish communities, like they do the same thing, or Mennonites or whatever. And so they would do that. Individual members were not allowed to have like outside jobs. So they would be, if you decided to come into the community, it eventually grew into like, okay, now you're going to work in one of our delis, or, work on this assembly line for makeup and make boxes and, keep them going for hours and hours and hours at a time, doing this like assembly line kind of factory work, or you're going to be a construction worker working for our businesses, because we share the wealth. So none of these people actually collect any money from what they do. So if, like, let's say you were going to visit a Yellow Deli and you were like, I really want to just get lunch at this place today, and you had no idea, like you had no idea about this group, right? You'd be like, oh yeah, this is a really nice place. I like the aesthetic. It's quiet. It's relaxed. These people are so nice. But the person that's serving you doesn't get a paycheck. They've probably worked for like 18 hours. You don't know how long they've been working. They're probably below the age that they're allowed to even work based on child labor laws. And it said that like any money that goes into the business goes back into the community, which, okay, I mean, I could see that happening, but at the same time, when does it get to the point where that also doesn't allow people to have autonomy over what they can be able to do with themselves? Now they are just part of this group. You are not an individual anymore. That's just with work. That's not even like if you're getting married into the group. And then if you leave the group, you can't have access to those people that are within that group. So family members lose family members because they're no longer allowed to visit if they leave. And people within the group are not allowed to have their own cell phones. Now the elders can have all of these things. They could get in a car and drive away. They can get on a cell phone. They could get on a computer. I mean, obviously they have businesses and they have websites and stuff. So they have people doing this. You can't just do that from not having these things, but they're not allowed to have television. They're not allowed to go out to the movies. They're not allowed to listen to the radio. They're like, you're not allowed to read books that are not of what the elders would say are okay. And pretty much every book except for the Bible and your free papers are not worth reading. So you can't contact people on the outside, like family members on the outside, if you decide to become a part of this group. But when you speak to these individuals, it's as though they act like it's, because when I did it, I spoke to somebody on the phone a while back, and I did like sort of like a mini interview with them. And, they said, oh, that's not true. Because I had asked, are people allowed to reach out to loved ones? Are they allowed to do this or that? Basically what I told you they're not allowed to do. Oh, no, no. Everybody has the right to leave whenever they want to. They have the right to speak to family. They have the right to do all of these things, but we limit the amount of TV, or we limit, but some of the communes don't even have like electricity or running water. So, and when you go to these delis, right, you're unsuspecting, you're getting food from these people thinking it's nice and organic and look at these nice people, and that person's not getting a paycheck. They may not be able to reach out to their family ever again unless they quietly leave in the middle of the night, which ex-members have. It's quite sad,
Absolutely. Any organization that has a shunning policy is extremely problematic in my eyes, from the stories that I've heard and from the effects that it can have on the individual and the family members that are now cut off from that individual. But there's so much that you've mentioned in that segment that's important to look at in closer detail. So this commune in Tennessee that Eugene Spriggs sets up with his wife, it's almost like the testing ground for expansion. Mm-hmm. This is where they come up with their ideas around education, around their ideas of child discipline, around their ideas of marriage and relationships, and what time the day starts and what time it ends, and various jobs that need to be carried out on the commune. And it's kind of similar to how groups like Synanon started. Synanon started right. with heroin addicts looking for a place to get together because there was Alcoholics Anonymous, but there wasn't really a place for people that were struggling with substance abuse or substance addiction to go in and get support. And it was almost like the people that were struggling with substance abuse or substance abuse and substance addictions were being turned away from things like AA. So Charles Diederich is like, hey, come and hang at my place. That wasn't really his place, I don't think. I think he did like a Charles Manson and kind of just hung around with people that did have a place for him to crash. And so one or two people start sleeping on the sofa on the floor, and then they stay, and then more and more people come and join. And then before you know it, there's a safe haven for people that are struggling with substance addiction to come. And then they get the shop on the beachfront in Santa Monica, and it just grows and grows and grows.
Yeah.
So I don't think that Charles E. Diederich set out to have a commune, but of course that is exactly what he ended up with, and more so. And people would earn their keep by using the skills that they had or skills that they could develop within the commune. So if you were an accountant before you joined Synanon, then you would help with financial things. If you were a mechanic, or if you had an interest in cars and some experience in how to fix them, then you would work in the car repair section of the commune. And so it sounds very similar in the way that it just starts off with a few like-minded people who are kind of crashing together, who think, we really have worked out a system or a way in which we feel is true to our belief systems. And once the first commune is established, and it grows and grows and grows, and then they buy a bigger plot of land, and they really start to hone in on what they believe is the correct way to do things, and have a very positively functioning community, then it expands, and they use the blueprint that they've created and the template that they now have to send faithful and devoted members to a couple of states over, to open a deli over there, or to open a coffee shop over there, and then to get a rural piece of land, or a big home, and invite other families in. And the interesting thing that you said about the volunteers that work in the deli, it's expected to tip over in America, and I imagine that they are not allowed to keep the tips that they receive. But something I watched in one of the videos that I watched to kind of prepare for our interview today was something that Telltale Atheist did around the 12 tribes. And he mentioned that the people that work in the deli, you couldn't just join the 12 tribes tomorrow and be given a position in the deli. It's a very funneled and very systematic ladder that people need to climb, or would be expected to climb, in order to be offered a position to work in one of the delis. Because of course that is very secular. It's out in the world. You're interacting with people outside of the faith-based group. So what would tend to happen from the research that he could find was that people would live on the commune for a certain amount of time, be very isolated and cut off from anything outside of that commune and that community, and take part in the religious activities and the faith-based obligations that come with living on the commune, and adhere to the restrictions and the clothing and the dietary requirements, and observe Sabbath on the Saturdays. And then when they were seen to be devoted enough to the cause, would be invited to go to the nearest deli and be offered a position to work extremely long days for very, very little.
And it's kind of it's frustrating because you could unexpectedly go into a place and not ever realize that you are participating in slave labor, right? Or child labor or whatever. You don't even know that, because these people are not getting paid anything, or they might be too young to even be able to work. So you're supporting something and you wouldn't even know it until maybe somebody said something to you, and you might be like, really? But I go there all the time. It seems like such a nice place. it doesn't matter, you know.
It's so interesting that you've just mentioned that, how the deli is almost a front for the 12 tribes, and how it might not be obviously linked straight away, because I had an email from my friend Mark over at Talk Beliefs, and he has his YouTube channel that people should definitely go in and check out if they're interested in this type of conversation and deep dives into faith-based groups and high demand religious groups and other interesting things. Because Mark at Talk Beliefs, he sent me an email that said that he's been seeing in his local shopping centre in London lots of advertising for this show that talks about, it's a stage show called Shen Yun, and it's being advertised in local shopping centres. And he said it's basically a musical production about China before communism. And he said that they've been in this shopping centre for ages with big billboards, handing out flyers, advertising the show. And he was like, oh, maybe I'll go. But then he got an article in his inbox that basically just said from peoplesworld.org had done an expose saying that the stage show itself is funded by the is funded by the cult Falun Gong, which is very problematic in itself. If anybody's heard of that group, there's a lot of talk around belief in aliens and other worldly species, and they have very problematic views around communism, and Falun Gong's like a whole other rabbit hole. But it was interesting that Mark sent me that, because he was like, I never would have ever realized that this group was working behind the front of the stage show. So all of the money that's raised could just be funneled straight back into a group like Falun Gong. So not only could you be inadvertently supporting child labor or slave labor, you could also be endorsing the other things that happen within the 12 tribes outside of the delis, in places like the communes, which we know from news articles and inside videos is also extremely problematic. And I'm sure we will talk a lot more about that as we get into things, because a lot of the rhetoric and a lot of the child abuse is what might give this group the cult label from outsiders looking at news articles and the high demand control methods that are used within the group. So now that we've kind of talked about the business side of things and how the 12 Tribes supports itself through various propaganda that's free on their website, through recruiting, all of the Yellow Delis seem to be set up near college campuses, which we know is a hotspot for vulnerable people to be recruited into high demand groups, because they're in transitional periods away from home, away from friends and family and things that are familiar. They may be struggling with homesickness, or struggling with finances, or struggling with the extreme workload that they suddenly have been faced with, and the responsibility of going to classes to obtain this next level of education. Loads of different reasons that a young person might be susceptible to the influences of a high demand religious group or any kind of high demand group at that particular period in their life. So the Yellow Delis are set up near campuses. We've talked all about the people that work in the delis and how the delis kind of distribute some of the things that they have, that they are making and packaging within the delis and the coffee shops before that. But the life of a 12 Tribes member on the commune is very different. It's like a whole other thing to the delis in itself. So You've mentioned briefly things like the shunning, the marriage ceremonies, but what do you know of the beliefs and practices of the 12 tribes? Do you have an idea, or can you tell us what their belief system is, if it differs and how it differs from other new religious movements? And from there, we might be able to understand a little bit about their rituals and ceremonies.
So they believe themselves to be a Christian group because other Christian groups might not believe that they are a Christian group. They're kind of like, they're like the Mormons of Christianity. People would say that Mormons will call themselves Christians, but then other like a Baptist Christian would say, no, Mormons are not Christians because they have this other set of beliefs in this other book, even though they also follow the Bible. So it's kind of like that. Like they believe themselves to be a Christian group that grew out of this movement in the 1970s, but they're like messianic in their like rituals and their beliefs. So they practice Pentecost and Passover and a number of other different messianic traditions. And I don't know if they follow things kosher, and like, I know that they don't in their restaurants because they're in a restaurant serving the public. And they're not really considered that, but I know that I don't know what they themselves at home do, but I know that they follow a mostly vegetarian diet, although they do allow themselves to have meat like as a special indulgence. But that might be for like all the people that are not elders. Like the elders sometimes get special treatment behind the scenes where people aren't seeing it. So they may eat dinner at a different time, or so they believe in Jesus as the Son of God. So like any like Christian group, they're like Trinitarian. They call him Yeshua, which they say is the closest to what Jesus's name actually was in Hebrew. They believe that accepting and living by the Bible is the only way to get to heaven, like the only way, but it has to be their way. It's not like living by the Bible and then going to a Pentecostal church or a Baptist church, or it's what the 12 tribes is telling you and what they're teaching from the Bible. Hell is the ultimate consequence for those who leave the group. So it's not leaving Christianity on the outside. You're already in hell. If you leave the group, you're in hell. Or if you're not following the Bible and the way that they're teaching it, and you're kind of going against what they say, which a lot of people within the group aren't typically doing. A lot of them just end up leaving because they just can't deal with the rigid structure of the group. But if you don't follow exactly what the Bible is telling you from what the 12 tribes elders are telling you that the Bible is saying, then you are going to hell. But they get up. I know that and I'm not sure if every single commune is set up the same, because I'd have to go that would take a lot of research to do, like on an individual by individual basis. And they also live in different parts of the world, so the times would be different. But let's take, for example, a place in New York, right? Let's say that there's a commune in New York and they get up at like 4 a.m. and they start their morning ritual of like having Bible study. And this is like an everyday thing. So they're supposed to get up at 4 a.m, have a Bible study, do music and dance, and they go on with their day. They're either working on the farm or somebody is working for a construction company, building stuff, or they start their day. The women are usually home. So women are the keepers of the home. They are supposed to have a lot of kids, a lot of children. They're the ones that educate the children, although there are men that educate the children too, within their commune. And their education is basically like fundamentals, like, ABCs and learning your numbers when you're really little. Then as you get older, you might learn a trade, and you'll learn a lot of biblical stuff. You're just learning a lot about what the Bible is teaching you, and it's how to live in the world but not be in the world, by working and learning to do just everyday tasks. And they're not really allowed to leave. They say that you could come for a time. And so here's another problematic thing. So they'll say that they'll talk to others about their beliefs, and they're on the street, maybe they're just handing out some literature, and they'll talk to somebody that's coming off of a college campus, and they're like, hey, I'm having, and I saw this in a little news, like a little news clip, where a guy was sitting at the Yellow Deli. He was a journalist, and he was handed a pamphlet, and they were like, oh, it's Friday night, and we have this like Friday night celebration. Why don't you come join us? And he goes, oh, okay. So he goes and he watches what they're doing. He goes and he said that, they said that there was no limit on how long he could stay. You could stay for as long as you want. And you can leave whenever you want. So these people are told that they could come in and they could stay as long as they want. They could leave whenever they want. And, you think, oh, wow, okay, so that's really nice. Like, I could come in and come out anytime I want. But when you get, like, if you're in the mindset that, let's say you are a person who is struggling with something, and you are looking for just a community or just people to be caring to you, and these people are showing you that concern with whatever it is that you're struggling with, you're like, come on in and join us. Then you're gaining, like, you're gaining that confidence that you didn't maybe have before, because they're putting their trust in you, and now you're trusting in them. And they're like, we cook meals together, we eat, then they all eat meals together. They do a lot of their activities all together, and you'll have like lots and lots of families living together under one roof. But then sometimes people will get stuck because they're like, I don't want to leave. This is like amazing. And they might put on a front for like a guest who is coming in, and the guest doesn't see that a child is being abused multiple times a day because they believe that the Bible tells them that this is something that should be done, and that they're hit with their like sticks and rods that are left around the house. They're called balloon sticks. Or they'll even pull a branch off of a tree and start hitting a child with it. Like, there are many news stories that have come to light that there were abuses going on, and the children were taken out of these communities because of that. But this outsider is not going to see it. They're going to say, wow, I really want to be in a place where these people really do have a concern for my well-being, and I don't have that at home, or I'm lonely, or I have no friends. And so they end up staying in this place. And then they come to realize, maybe after a month or two of being there, or 3, that, no, okay, you cannot have your phone now. You have to give it to us because you are now part of this community. You have to give up your old job, or you might not need to attend those college classes anymore because you're not going to need them anyway. Christ is coming soon. You're not going to need them. We need to do what's going to further the kingdom of God, right? And they're taking these people in who are not suspecting any of this, who might not know the group and just want a place to go. And then they get stuck. And then they start to become part of that mentality too. And now they're doing it to other people. And then it's just like feeding off of it. And then they get people that come into the community. There were 1 or 2 instances where I read a story about they were just letting people come in as they wanted to, and they could stay in the house communally with like families that have children and people that were convicted child molesters and were accused of rape that were allowed to stay in these homes because they don't look at that person anymore. They're now coming to be fixed, right? They don't do background checks on people. I mean, you're not going to do that when you go to church either. Like the pastor's not doing background checks on all of his members. But at the same time, you go in the church and then you leave the church. You're not staying in a communal household for days at a time or months at a time. And then now you have a convicted child molester living among you. And it's not really talked about because the kids have no way of communicating. They're not allowed to speak. They're not allowed to call the police. They're not trusting of anybody on the outside. They don't even know what the outside is. If they want to talk to an adult about something that they feel was done against their will, they're usually silenced and then they're punished for it. So, and there's a lot more about the child abuse that goes on within this community. That's just part of it. And it's sad because when the legal system does try to do something about it, you might have those within the legal system that for some reason are not accusing the adults who should be accused of this particular crime, and then the children are sent back. And I don't know if that went off topic from what we were originally discussing, but it's sort of like,
it was flowing. Yeah, it was definitely flowing in a coherent way. And it's clear that all of your kind of research was tying itself together as you were talking. And one of the things that I had written down here in terms of the children, that there's not a lot of laws around homeschooling in America. So the bar for the curriculum and what's expected for the education of homeschooled children in America is quite low, unfortunately. And I know that there's a lot of activism taking place in certain parts of that country at the moment that is trying to tackle homeschooling as an industry or as a practice. But something that stuck out to me from some of the research that I did was that children are not allowed to play in any right. sense of the word. Nope. So if they try to make believe, or if they try to make up games with their peers or their siblings, then they are, as you mentioned, whipped, paddled, struck on the hands or the backside. And something that is also restricted and forbidden within the 12 tribes is any type of anthropomorphism. So if there's any talking animals, so if there was to be a depiction of Noah's Ark, if any of the animals were seen to be talking, or if the sun has a smile on its face or anything like that, then those texts or images would not be allowed within the 12 tribes. And I don't know if that's because that encourages play or make believe or imagination, but that is so detrimental to a child's development and learning and just their right to be a child and play and create games and be competitive and learn through play. That's one of the most important things. My 8-month-old is already she is going for every ball, every teddy, every toy. She is just grabbing hold of anything that she can find. And if it sings a song and lights up, oh my goodness, she is just in her element. So to basically just silence children, and from the minute that they can work, there are testimonies that say that children are out in the communes working 12+ hour days of hard labor, much like Veni Kocius when she talked to me about her experiences in Sam Fife's The Move of God, where she and her siblings, who were not allowed to talk to each other, who were completely separated, who, if they were caught even making eye contact, would be disciplined, were taken away from their family and from each other, and would have to just pick potatoes out of the ground for 12 hours a day until their hands were bleeding. And if they weren't quick enough, then there'd be punishment for that as well. And that is so sad to think about, the times where children should be flourishing and learning their individualism and the things that they like and the things that they dislike are just put to work harder than the average adult in most parts of the world works from day to day for money to support themselves and their family.
Yeah. And they are known to do this, they see. So what I can compare it to is, because I live around the Amish, I'm going to just use them as the example, but you'll see like an 8 or a 10-year-old like on the back of on a plow he's on, like, I can't really describe it, but he'll be standing holding like a team of horses on this like plow, and the horses are just going, and he's like plowing the field, and they do this all day, and then you'll see them like digging out in the field, and I'm like, I could see, like, I it's funny because I see that, and I'm like, wow, that kid is really like, gonna know how to run his own farm one day. But at the same time, I'm like, that kid is so young. They do play. The Amish kids, I see Amish kids playing all the time. They're outside kicking a ball around, or they're on the swings or whatever in their own, like area where they live on their land. Because we live near so many Amish farms, like I see them all the time, but they work alongside their parents. But when I see this occurring within like this particular community, and hearing about kids that are disciplined for not doing enough work with being able to pull up a wheelbarrow that's way bigger than they are, and like kind of just doing hard work throughout the day, not getting a proper education, and not being able to actually just play and doing what they're developmentally supposed to be doing for their age in order to grow those brain pathways to make their brain grow and to figure out the world even better as they grow. You're now like sticking them into this like bubble and not allowing that human being to grow, and they're stunting their ability to be able to learn things the way that they're developmentally supposed to be. If they were someday to decide to move out into the world and do their own thing, they're like, what do I do? And there was a case where a 14-year-old boy was in school. He ran away. Like, he ran away from his home. He was 14 and he was adopted. He was from one of the New York communes, and he was sitting in the classroom, like in one of his little classroom, like a couple desks, and there was a teacher up there, and asked a question of the class, and the boy didn't raise his hand, as he says, and his name is Kevin Donovan, and he does say it in the video, and I think I sent you the link for it, but he didn't raise his hand, and the teacher went out and got a branch and made him pull his pants down and just started hitting him as hard as he could. And the kid stood up and he ran towards his father's office. I guess that was like right near the classroom. And the father asked how many times he was spanked or struck. And the kid said, I don't know, maybe like 9 or 10 times. So his father takes out a bamboo stick and starts hitting him even more and even harder than the teacher did. And he said, you didn't get the discipline, you didn't take the full discipline the first time. Now you have to go back and take it again. And so he had to go back in and get hit by his teacher because he didn't raise his hand in class. And the boy just eventually, I don't know how he escaped. They didn't really go into detail about it, but he escaped the community and he was adopted out. He was so young. That's like one of those cases that doesn't happen too often. He like knew to leave. Some people, because of the fact that they don't have the proper developmental tools to grow from, where like imaginative play and all of that, and you're not even allowed to play at all, how are you going to like grow your brain enough to even just know that there's an alternative to what you're doing? You're going to be stuck in that community forever because it's all you know, and you might be afraid to leave because you don't know what else to do because you haven't been taught that. But that's on purpose. That's why they do it.
And of course, the shunning practice that is in place means that if you were to leave and you were born into this movement or you joined, and as you said, you go for a couple of months and the dependency grows and grows and grows to the point where you are so dependent on the leadership within these high demand groups that you have no way of functioning without the group. And if you are to leave the group, you may not any longer have a support or ever previously had a support network outside of the group if you were born in. So both scenarios pose a problem for somebody looking to escape a high demand group. If you're born in and you leave and you are shunned, you might not have a place to go or any money or any worldly experience or secular experience on how to communicate with people outside of a high demand religious group. And then, of course, if you are so dependent on the group after you've joined that you can't make any decisions without the leadership, which, you know, you've already explored happens over a very long period of time, and you say, I'll just stay around for a little while and see how it goes. And then it gets harder and harder and harder to leave. At this point, you may not have easy access or contact with family and friends that you've cut off or had to cut off for such a long period of time during your tenure with the 12 tribes or similar high demand religious groups. And so it's not just as easy as moving away and leaving, even if you have the cognitive forethought to do that. And you've tried to plan ahead. And what you mentioned about kids working, you know, if I owned a farm or a homestead, I may want some help from the family in the same way that we have a vacuum cleaner and my son has a matching mini vacuum cleaner that he likes to, he likes to drag around the house and kind of make more mess than we had before we started to hoover. But we don't have farmland and we don't have we have a nice huge backyard, but we don't have anything like that. But if you lived on a farm and it was a family run farm, then you might there might be a level of expectancy of children to help with some of the workload in the same way that kids might do chores in the house for pocket money or allowance. You know, you kids, you do the dishes and you sweep the floor, or let's change our bedding, and those simple life skills that you encourage, not only to make the house cleaner and life easier for everybody. I mean, maybe not necessarily the kids if you're having to nag at them all the time to do their chores, but also just helping them to develop those basic life skills that they need when they do leave. But it's very different to say, have you done your chores, than it is to expect a child to pick potatoes out of the ground until their hands bleed for 14 hours a day. Yeah, exactly. And like, so we have a yard here and I have a garden, and my kids, you know, they'll come out and help me with the shovel and dig dirt and dig in the dirt for worms and like pick veggies and all that kind of stuff.
they're doing it for fun and they're learning, but I'm not forcing them to go out and do that for 13 hours a day. So yeah, there is very much a difference. And obviously, we're not talking about it's child abuse to have kids and it's child labor to have them outside helping on a family farm, because this is not what that is. This is you're forcing children to not get a proper education, and you're forcing them to do labor for long periods of time, which is what this group does. And then they're doing that so that they can sell, their products wherever and get the money for it. And then it goes back into the community. But you're using child labor for that for long periods of time. And it could be like 100 degrees out, depending on where you're living, right? And you're having kids work out in the hot sun, like for long periods of time. And they might not be allowed to take a break to eat. They only could do that when everybody else is allowed to do it. And their needs are very different than an adult. So it's not normal, and it's not good for the children in this community to endure stuff like that.
And it's my understanding that the religious organization itself is classed as a 501b for-profit religious organization. So they do have a tax exemption status, but they pay property taxes. And there's videos of Eugene Spriggs justifying their lack of reporting historical abuse to the authorities because they pay property taxes, which in itself is convoluted. But what you said about how the money from the child labor or just from the slave labor and potentially human trafficking, if you're
there's human trafficking involved too.
If you're looking at citizens outside of their home country that don't have access to their passport or money or understand the native language of the country that they are then in, and they are still working the same amounts, it's much like what Mary Mahoney talked about with her experiences in the Children of God when she got isolated over in Japan, and even with all the that side of things, we don't really know exactly what's happening with the money. And when the group first started, it's, as you said, Eugene Spriggs had the idea that everybody would be treated equal. For the time in 1972, it fit in with the attractive, progressive movements that were saying, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter your gender, it doesn't matter your ethnicity, it doesn't matter your background. Let's all just be together and practice this true religion in the way that we think is best. But of course, that progressiveness didn't last for long, because Eugene Spriggs was then at some point being called the Anointed One, and then you have elders, and so there's already this hierarchy coming into play, and the elders have special treatment that is so hypocritical, because then you're kind of going back to the reason the group started in the first place, and that's because one church service decided that they wanted to go watch the Super Bowl, and the original founding members don't think that that's good enough. But then again, the elders are allowed to dabble in things that the other followers and devout members aren't, because that's seen as sinful or secular or outside and worldly. So that in itself is also convoluted.
Yeah, and I think like I said before, I don't think originally they believed that they would be to the point where they had come to. And now that they garnered all this support and eventually this like power of who they are, because he's like the founding member, right? He's a founding leader of this group, that he has to be anointed in some way. He has to be like God's next chosen one, the prophet, and we have to follow him because everything he's saying to us makes sense and it's true. And because you have this happening, maybe he himself doesn't really care about the religious aspect of it anymore, right? Maybe he, in his mind, fell out of that. And then, but he knows that like he has this power now. Like he's the overseer of all of these people, and he can just tell them what to do, or he could tell the elders to tell all the lay people what to do, and it will get done. Because look at what he's created. He has the power, and he could just do whatever he wants now, and nobody could say anything to him or touch him. Now, I'm not saying that that's what he thought. You know, I don't know what in his mind he was thinking. Maybe he still believed in it, and maybe it got to the point where he kind of started to believe in his own lies about who he was.
That also sounds familiar of David Berg with the Children of God, who kind of started off with this core group and expanded with this international business. Yes. And now it's a multi-million-dollar religious movement that that has grown to be worth that much money, or to have made that much money through human trafficking and slave labor and child abuse. It's so it feels very similar in that way. The Unification Church is still the number one sushi provider in America, so they are still making millions and have made billions of dollars through their newspaper, I think it's the Washington Times, that they created. And so a lot of these new religious movements have these business infrastructures that support them and enable them to continue growing. So it wouldn't surprise me if Spriggs had started off sincere in his thoughts, but as the empire that is the 12 tribes continued to grow and grow and grow and grow, that it became more about growing a business than it did spreading the message of Yeshua and their love for the one true Jesus and their love for their belief system. So we've talked a little bit about some of the problematic things that are happening within the 12 tribes that we know are happening from testimonies, from witness statements, from court cases, from news articles. But something that comes along with the religion or religious movement positioning itself as progressive and then quickly changing its stance on that comes the oppression of women within the group, and how wives are expected to submit to their husbands and to dress in certain ways. And I actually read somewhere that women are expected to have at least 7 children.
I don't know about that. They might be. I don't know. I don't even know. Why is it because the number 7 is supposed to be like the special number, right? Number 7's like not lucky number 7. They wouldn't believe in luck, but it's like the perfect number because the earth was created in 7 days, and the whatever biblical interpretation that they have. But I didn't actually read about that. That's interesting. That's something new. But I know that they were supposed to have as many children as they could, based on having a quiver full in the Old Testament, and wanting to build God's kingdom. So that's something really interesting. But so another problematic thing with this community in regards to women is the fact that they don't, and it with everybody really, the elders, of course, are possibly just a little bit more special in that they could receive treatment. But when it comes to lay people, especially women, they don't get to receive the proper medical treatment they need, especially when they're pregnant and ready to go throughout the pregnancy, and then ready to go into labor and deliver that child. And this causes a lot of, and with a lot of the other things that this group does and believes in, they induce a lot of like psychological trauma. And there was a case of a woman in Australia. Her name was Rosemary Cruzado. I don't know if you saw any video of her at all, but she was on one of the, I think, a current affair specials that they did on the 12 tribes. And she was part of the 12 tribes community for a really long time. She had given birth to a few children there, maybe 2 or 3, or maybe it was her 3rd or 4th child. She started feeling not right with her pregnancy, and she was saying to the elders that she felt like she really needed proper medical care. And they kept saying, no, you need to deliver here. You need to just be taken care of by the midwives here. We have these midwives who know exactly what to do. And they have books on this particular way of treating women who are pregnant, like with preeclampsia or with other medical conditions that may occur when you are pregnant. And this woman had preeclampsia, possibly had preeclampsia. She had all of the symptoms of it. And I completely understand, because I had preeclampsia with my 3rd child. So I'm listening to her story and I'm like, I can't believe this woman did not get any medical treatment. She could have died. Luckily she didn't, but her baby was stillborn.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And this is not uncommon for this group. I mean, women will have, they have a high number of stillbirths, or babies who are born and they die soon after, or even like a couple days, hours or days after, because they might have had a medical condition that could have easily been treated by a proper medical doctor. And they're instead using these pamphlets that say, take these herbs to cure preeclampsia, take this for whatever, if you have a whatever kind of condition, take this. And there was an investigation that was done in New South Wales, Australia, on the Peppercorn Creek Farm. And then like near Sydney, I think there were two investigations that were done in 2020, because this woman, based on her story and the story of an ex-member who was an ex-elder, he went by the name Han, but his real name was Scott Zarnecki. And another scandal came along with that, because he died in 2020, I think, also, or 2021, in a fire that was ruled as a homicide by a 17-year-old tribes member. But Zarnecki was showing, he a couple months before he had died, and this woman, Rosemary, who also gave her testimony, this elder who was talking about, he left the community, and he left his wife and did his wife and his children leave? Maybe I'm mixing it up with another story. So I'll just talk about him. He left, and he was telling like different news outlets about all of these abuses that were happening. And one in particular was the story of what Rosemary went through. I don't think he mentions her name, but he does mention, like, there were times where there was a woman, she was pretty much on the way to her death, and they brought her to the hospital like right before she was ready to give birth, and luckily she survived. But if she didn't get that medical treatment at the hospital, she would have even died. And there was sources that had mentioned that there were remains that were buried of these stillborn children. And yeah, I mean, it's really morbid and really grim, and it's very upsetting.
Especially because, first of all, they always tell you at the hospital when you're going through your pregnancy, if you feel as a pregnant woman, if you feel that there is anything wrong, you must trust those instincts. And she knew, even if she didn't feel in herself, she knew something was wrong. And it's extremely dangerous for somebody who is pregnant to be carrying around an unborn that's no longer living. It's so hard to even get the words out.
I know.
But for some women, you said luckily she'd survived, but for some women, they would have rather it be the other way around, that they didn't survive and that their child did. And the fact that that could have been avoided if she received proper medical care is so heartbreaking to think about. And if there is such a rejection of modern medicine and medical assistance in these situations, then there absolutely is no space for sciences to help women going and fathers going through that level of grief of losing an unborn child, and those families that have buried these stillborn babies that have been found in these grave sites, and to never receive any kind of therapy or access to professional advice on how to deal with the grief that comes with losing a child. I cannot even begin to think. I mean, our daughter was born with jaundice that we didn't realize until she was a couple of days old, and her eyes were really yellow, and she had to go back into hospital for UV treatment. But if we wouldn't have realized, if the midwife didn't come round to check on us a couple of days after we were discharged from the hospital, and they said, we think she needs to go back in, who knows what could have happened and what complications could have arose. She just needed to go on like a little sunbed for a few hours. And how many times must this have happened in these types of really insular groups, where it could have been as simple as a few hours on a UV treatment bed for the baby to just be okay.
Yeah, I know. Well, and then this one ex-member, he was higher up in the community, and he was an elder, and his wife had their third child, and they had to be rushed to the hospital, and he was allowed to because he was an elder. And they went to the hospital, and they said, your wife needs to get a C-section because the baby is not going to be birthed correctly and the baby might die. And they said, well, we're not going to do that, because if God put the baby there the way that it should be, and it needs to be birthed the way that God intended, and if the baby doesn't survive, that was God's will. And this is what this poor woman, Rosemary, and other people who I have read about or heard talk about this similar situation going through this, they are blamed for the fact that their babies died because they're sinful.
Goodness,
and so they're blamed for the death of their children, and that they need to get right with God, because God will never bless them with children unless they get that sin out of their life. And something caused that baby to die within her because she was sinful, and that's God's justice.
Oh my gosh, that's hideous. On top of the grief that the family must already be feeling around the death, and then to have that blame put on
the mother.
Oh,
and the father too, but the fathers are also blamed too. And it's it's extremely awful to hear stories like that, because I had postpartum depression, I had prenatal depression, and my babies were fine, and I just still had it, right? But then I developed preeclampsia with my third child, and I had to be monitored every day, and I had to deliver her early because it could have killed me and it could have killed her. And I'm very lucky that I was able to go to the doctor and have them check me constantly, because if they didn't, I wouldn't be here talking to you right now, because it was that bad, and I might not have a almost 3-year-old right now. And I cannot imagine the grief that these women, especially because they're the ones carrying that child to term, and then they're forced to birth a stillborn child or a child afterwards. And I'm so sorry that this is like really upsetting. But it's part of what this group does in order to make people like try to stick with them, because they're telling them that there's still something not good enough about them, that God is punishing them for this, whether as an individual or as a couple, and that they need to make it right. And the only way you can make it right, which is like the tenet of like their core beliefs, is that you can't even be out in the outside world going to a church. This is the only true church that you can belong to, this community. So if you're not even right within the community, God is punishing you for that. And he's showing you right here. Do you see how this is working, right? And then they're just basing their medical pseudoscience off of like what they believe the Old Testament is telling them to do, but the Old Testament isn't giving them medical advice on what kind of herbs to make. This is just like whatever herbalists they might have in their community who maybe have studied and think that these are things that they did in the past. Yeah, but there were lots of deaths in the past as well, because of the fact that they didn't have modern medical treatments. And so it's insane to think that this is part of the way that they will psychologically abuse members in order to keep them within the community on an experience that is so wrought with emotion and hardship and sadness when you go through something like this. But yet people will still stay. They still stay because they feel like it's the only way.
Sometimes women who have been through multiple pregnancies and labors find that their body is unable to cope with continuous pregnancies, and there's a huge strain on the women's body and each subsequent child that they do manage to birth. And of course, if there's no birth control available, and if you are expected to have these quiverful families of 7 kids or more, and there's a pressure on the woman and the man to provide this big family in the name of their chosen Messiah, or in the name of their chosen figurehead, then the pressure to continue doing that and to submit to the husband as well. So if it's his will to continue having children, then where is the autonomy for the woman in that scenario? And there's a huge thing around the matchmaking and marriage ceremonies that we can talk about with the 12 tribes after this section. But it reminds me a little bit of a conversation I had with an ex-Jehovah's Witness who was telling me about how her best friend at when she was younger, she ended up with a rare blood condition and she needed emergency blood transfusion, and her parents denied her that.
They don't. Yeah.
And despite the doctor's kind of wishes, the best friend of this survivor that I interviewed on the show did pass away. And to this day, it's extremely upsetting for her to talk about and think about and relive. The grief is still clear in the way that she communicates her memories of the friend that she lost. But then, as you mentioned, there was an elder whose child needed a transfusion, and they got the child the transfusion, and there were no repercussions for that decision, and the child grew up to be happy and healthy, and rightly so, if there is access to modern medicine in the way that we have access to modern medicine, because we're talking from a very privileged position that we can, because there are parts of the world where people don't have access to clean water or sanitary towels or toothpaste and toothbrushes. There'll be very remote parts of the world where they've probably never even seen medical equipment or know what a trained doctor looks like, because they're very remote and tribal parts of the world that we in the Western world haven't explored too much, and probably also rightly so. So we are talking from a very privileged position, especially me over here in the UK with the NHS, because I had extreme hyperemesis during my pregnancy. I was in hospital multiple times with both pregnancies on a drip for hydration. I was just sick all day, every day for 9 months straight. And I never paid. I mean, I pay my taxes, but I never got a bill for any of that treatment. And even for a year after you have a child, you have a maternity exemption certificate. So if you need any prescriptions, if you need any dental work, you still don't get a bill for any of that for up to a year after you have a child. So if I would have had an emergency C-section or any type of pain relief or any stitches or anything like that, I would not have paid for any of that. If I decided to stay an extra night in the hospital, or if I decided for my partner to be with me for the time that we stayed in the hospital with our newborn, we wouldn't have had to pay for an extra bed for him. We wouldn't have had to pay. We didn't pay for my meals. We didn't pay for any treatment that I needed. And some of the stories around women that have children in the US, it's like $250,000 just to go in for one night and have a pretty straightforward birth, as far as some of the stories that I've heard from friends I have over in America. And for a couple of friends that I have who have had complicated births that have resulted in emergency surgery and hysterectomies, well, I can't even, the astronomical bills that come from the emergency procedures, maybe that's part of it. Maybe that's part of why the modern medicine is rejected in these situations. But coming from a position of privilege where we do have access to modern medicine, and then to reject it because of such strict religious doctrine when it could save lives is And I know that people always say, Casey, you're not religious, you haven't experienced one of these groups, so you can't possibly understand. And it's so easy for you to sit there and say that people should reject everything that they've ever been taught throughout their entire lives. But it's right there. It's right there, and people have died because it hasn't been accessed in the way that you've just described. This woman, she lived, but her unborn child didn't, and that's so heartbreaking.
Yeah, and that's such a common occurrence, and that's why there was an investigation done in New South Wales, Australia. And I don't know a lot about the geography of Australia, but I think they said in Sydney too, or if it was around Sydney. But I know that there were two separate investigations on communes, and then this came from where the one elder who had passed away like a few months later, where the information about all this stuff came from. They actually only found, from what I could find, I looked for more recent information, and this was done I think it was done in 2020. I don't think I had anything from 2021, but they found one which they think was either 1 or 2 buried, but there are references to a commune in France about how they would try to hide the fact that they were burying, where they would get rid of the remains in other ways. So there may have been way more than these 1 or 2 that were buried that they found. Or did the investigation, were they told to stop and they weren't allowed back on the property again? I don't really know, because there wasn't much more about it except for the fact that they found 2, and then it was like 1 or 2, and then that was it. So
a lot of the children that come through the 12 tribes as well, from some of the things that I've seen and read, are undocumented, and there's actually no record of them existing because they're born within the community. And so, of course, if they're not accessing modern medicine or hospitals, and then there's no really there's no opportunity for that. And it's very similar to the stuff that I looked into around Rock Terrier and the Anthill Kids, and how they lived in a community very, very isolated from the outside world, and how there were a number of infant and toddler remains found around that group. And so then you start to think about, not only must the parents be suffering with grief and the family members be suffering from grief from the death of a loved one, but if the child manages to be born and is alive when they are born, but then dies from complications a few days or weeks or even a couple of years into their life, what about the pain and discomfort that the baby experiences, or that the infant or toddler experiences? That is so sad to think about, that such a short life spent in such a way. And kind of taking that to an extra level when I looked at the Anthill Kids. And if people are kind of sensitive to this information, I recommend just never ever learning about them, because I definitely probably shouldn't have. Any crying from pain is met with discipline in the form of extreme physical abuse that has been documented in the 12 tribes also. So any child that is upset or in pain or in discomfort or misses their parents, because there's so much family separation that happens within these movements as well, they are just met with physical abuse, and to the point where the children just become so despondent and zombie-like, because any kind of emotion seems to be met with physical repercussions.
Yeah, and that is what happens within the 12 tribes as well. Like, they have these, like I had mentioned before, and there was a visitor to the group who, there was a video he did. I don't remember if it was probably on YouTube. I sent you so many links, I don't remember which ones they were, but there's probably a video in there somewhere of a guy who was like kind of undercover, and he took a video of, like, near the fireplace in one of these communities, in one of the houses, where he saw like a packet that was like hanging from the fireplace of these sticks, these, like, they call them balloon sticks, but they're like, if you think of a balloon like on a stick, I don't know if you ever, you know what I mean? They're like plastic little sticks. They're kind of like that. Or like a 50 centimeter, I think that's like the biggest it could get, like, rod. But they could range in size, but they're like just like a stick that you would have hanging around in different parts of the house anytime your child makes any kind of a sound. And it could be anything. I mean, and it's not just the parents who are allowed to discipline their children, it's other members too, because you're living as a community and you are one family. So your kids could be happily like singing a song right in the living room, and the one starts to like do something, maybe they're like playing with their hair or scratching their arm, whatever they're doing that's distracting, and they could be told, like, you have to focus on what you're doing, or please stop. But typically it's a balloon stick, and you get hit with it to try to train you to go back into your place and be quiet. Or if you're singing, obviously you want to like be standing there and singing with your group and not playing around with your hair or whatever. But they routinely use these balloon sticks to try to train their child up in the way that they should go, so that they never veer off the path. It's kind of, I don't remember if it comes from the book of Ezekiel, or maybe I'm getting that wrong. I have them all in my notes here, but I have so many notes but they use like the stick as like, if you spare the rod, you spoil the child. That's another one that's always used, even though a rod was never, as somebody who has read the Bible a lot of times, the rod is never used to beat sheep into submission. It's used to point them on the way that they need to go and gently push them along, right? It's not used because that's what they use as their example. If you're going to spare that rod, then you're spoiling your child. Then your child is not going to grow up in the way that they need to in submission. And so they could be beaten for anything. But that's not what the Bible is actually telling them. But they're looking at it and interpreting it in that way. Like shepherds are not beating their sheep. They're gently getting them to go back into their pen or wherever they belong. And other members can easily just, if they don't like that the child is crying or being whiny, they could get another spanking. They could be taken into another room and paddled multiple times. Or, I mean, some of it is to the point where, like, I've heard stories of ex-members who, like, they're even told to, if they're changing their child's diaper and the child is moving around too much, turn them around and hit them a few times on the back or on the feet, the bottom of the feet, or on the hands to get them to stop, because it's like training a dog. And I'm thinking, I wouldn't even hit my dog. How do you do that to a human being?
That sounds a lot like Heather Grace Heath's story in her memoir Lovingly Abused, where they use blanket training. And if like the baby wriggles off the blanket, yep. Then you but then she describes how some of the parents would, if the baby wasn't wriggling enough to move off the blanket, would just move the baby off the blanket so that they could do the blanket training, which is just absolutely abhorrent.
Yeah. I mean, and how are you ever, that baby has no idea. Even small children, like when they start to develop and then they know, like, okay, they become fearful and they just kind of stop. It's not because they're learning to be a good person or to be a better person. They're learning fear. You're instilling trauma and fear into that baby or into those young children. And that's what they're going to grow up to either continue to do with maybe their children, or they might not be able to be right mentally from all of that abuse that they're enduring. And
from all angles, spiritual abuse, right. Educational abuse, physical.
Oh, right. Yes.
As you mentioned, there's no background checks on the types of people who are being invited in to join. So perhaps you're opening up the gates to people that really do have that really do get a kick out of administering that type of discipline on children. And if say my family were invited round to your families for dinner, and my husband or I feel like we punish children more severely than you do, and your child does something that I don't agree with, and then I severely punish your child with a spanking because we are a community. So if I see fit to punish your child, then I will. Who are you to tell me that I've been too severe? Is that seen as favoritism? Are you seen as protecting your child? Are you seen as kind of, there you go, you said don't spare the rod? Is that what you would be trying to do if you told me that I had been too harsh? Because that's exactly what happened with Mary Mahoney in her experiences when her children were struck in that way by other family members or people outside of her family. She couldn't say anything. She couldn't say, don't hurt my child, because then she would have been punished, or the punishment would have been more severe for her children after the punishment. There would have been an additional punishment for her children, because she would have been seen to have been favoring her children over other people's children. And rightly so. Is that not the maternal instinct to do that?
Right. Oh, of course. I oh my goodness. I couldn't even imagine. I couldn't even imagine having to live in an environment where this is routinely done and it's seen as normal. And like, I don't even like when people tell me how I should be raising my kids just by saying it, like, let alone having somebody else mete out abuse towards my children because they think that my children are not being up to their standards of what they think is good.
I really do think it must breed environments for predators to come in and take advantage of these particular practices as well in these insular communities. And if those people happen to be people in positions of leadership or positions of power, then even more detrimental to the child's development and to the child's well-being, because there's probably a very, very small chance that there will ever be any change in that situation if it is leadership that are the ones that are predators, more so than just the people carrying out these awful types of punishment. But you mentioned something about the book of Ezekiel before, and passages within the Bible are very important when it comes to the 12 tribes, because they are named after the 12 tribes of Israel. And I mentioned something about the number 7, and how women are expected to have 7 or more children. And I think the number 144,000, which is used so much in groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses and in the Latter-day Saints, it comes from Revelation 7, I believe, or it's at least referenced in Revelation 7. I myself haven't read the Bible, but the 144,000 people that are to go to heaven, it's made up of those 12 tribes of Israel. So there'll be 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes, which make up the 144,000 people that will go to heaven. Overall aim of the 12 tribes, as far as I could tell from my research, is that they are attempting to create their own army of 144,000 true members of the 12 tribes through the children that are born as second generation members of the 12 tribes. So once they have 144,000 second generation members of the 12 tribes, they will then have created God's kingdom on earth, and so can usher in the new age. Is that do you think that's right from the research that you've done?
I don't know. It's funny because I haven't really come across the 144,000 much within their group. So you may have even found information that I haven't. And I've been studying them for a long time, but that's one thing that I didn't really come across, or when I was trying to prepare for this, I didn't have in my notes. But I could see it, because it's such a, I'm not going to say it is, unless you have seen something that I haven't. It is a very common theme in a lot of Christian groups to focus on this particular number. And it does come from Revelation 7:4.
I think from what I'd read, that's why the restrictions and the punishments around the children are so severe, because the children have such a huge responsibility in ensuring that they pair off at some point and continue the lineage of 12 tribe members, so that they can get to this number. But there's so much more to talk about in terms of children growing up and pairing off, because I don't know if you managed to do any research around the matchmaking that happens within the 12 tribes, the marriage ceremonies and what they look like. And maybe then we can talk about a little bit of how the LGBTQIA plus community is viewed within the group, although I think the answer by this point is probably pretty obvious.
Sure. Yeah. For that, okay, so that one's an easy one. They're not considered to be clean. They're sinful. Marriages between one man and one woman, as prescribed in the Garden of Eden and Genesis by God. Anything outside of that is not according to God's plan for humanity. And so therefore they are sinful. Now, I don't know if they do any kind of like, you know how there are like the reprogramming or those kind of things that are done where
conversion therapy or anything.
Yes,
like that.
That's what I was trying to think. I was trying to think of the name of it. Yeah, conversion therapy that is done within groups sometimes that are more traditional, I would say, in their views of biblical interpretation. Because there are Christian groups that are pro LGBT, you know, and so that's obviously not what we're talking about here. So I don't know how they deal with that, because I haven't seen a lot of that by any ex-members but I know that for sure they, based on things that they have written, that shouldn't even exist, right? Like it's man and woman together, that's it. And the marriage ceremonies now, and I don't know what kind of punishment they would mete out within the communities. Would they be kicked out if they found out a member was part of a group? I'm just saying the group because it's easier to just say LGBT. Like, let's say they did find out like a member was gay and they were preaching all this stuff, but the person themselves, they maybe still wanted to be true to who they were, but then they were feeling conflicted, but they didn't do anything to try to get married or to change or to, I don't know if they would, I'm assuming that they would be kicked out of the community or told, or I don't know if they would get any kind of conversion type therapy within the community. But I know that it's not acceptable among the members. Also, the marriage ceremonies are interesting. So you've seen the videos of, like you said, like Midsummer and how the women dress and everything. And you could find marriage ceremonies of 12 tribes members on YouTube. Like if you just looked it up, you can find them. But they'll do like, sometimes they'll go for a few days of celebrations. They will, or it might just be one day. And the entire community gets involved. And they have these large, like, choreographed dances and stuff that act out different scenes from the Bible. And they use, like, they don't use a lot of props, really, but they might dress a little bit different just in order to act out scenes from the Bible. They play a lot of music. They make their own instruments and they play all their own instruments, and they learn how to play their instruments for this ceremony. They also, like, the woman and the man sing a song to each other or multiple songs to each other. The parents, I don't remember if it's both sides or if just the woman's side says, like, that the father is giving his daughter away to the husband, and that now I'm giving her for you to watch over and for her to submit to you or to take care of her, or whatever wording they use. And it's a very long ceremony, and they might include some messianic tradition into the way like they lift people up on chairs or whatever within their ceremonies, or their dances are sort of messianic in nature. I don't know. Their wedding ceremonies are very interesting. And then when the woman sings a song, like she'll sing a song to the husband that's about him and her love for him, but then it also includes a lot of like biblical references about how, and I'm just taking from one example. I'm not sure how all the songs are because they're all different. Everybody does their own thing within each community, but like one in particular, the woman was on her like knees looking up to him, and she's singing about like how he's going to like rule over her, and it was very bizarre. I'm not trying to laugh about it, but it's just, to me, it's just bizarre because like I don't view the world in that way. So it's like, aren't you supposed to be just standing up and looking each other in the eye? But they don't believe that they're truly equal in that sense, right? So
I think if we've watched the same video, it might have been in one of the links you sent me. The woman explains before her wedding ceremony or after her wedding ceremony that she's not actually really seen as an individual. She's kind of used as a metaphor for her love for Jesus, or she is used as a symbol throughout her marriage ceremony, and instead of actually seen as the bride of the groom. And that was really interesting to me. And also there's a lot of matchmaking that takes place, which insinuates arranged marriages and how the woman doesn't actually have a lot of say around who she ends up married to.
Yeah, I think it depends. Like I had mentioned many times, the elders, like they're the ones that could make the decision, right? If they may want like their children to make that decision on their own. Like they look like they might be in love, or they look like they would be a good match, but let's let them see if it works for them. Like there are some people that are able to make mention, if you are like from the lay people, that you're interested in, this particular person and that you might like to marry them. But I think it's mostly the men who would have the say in that, not necessarily the women. But I mean, you might have a couple that really does truly love each other and they do get married, but there is a lot of arranging of marriages that happen within the community, just maybe based on like the level of hierarchy that is within the church. So,
which if it's the pressure coming from other family members or other members within the community, is unfortunate for the husband and the wife, for both parties involved. If it's the man, much like in an interview I did recently about a group called Kwasi Ubuntu that started over in South Africa, it's the man will go up to the woman and say, I would like to marry you. God has shown me a vision where we get married. And the woman is supposed to go away and think about it for a couple of days before she makes a decision. But there's already a lot of pressure from leadership and governing bodies to come back and say yes to that proposal, especially if the woman is above the age of 18, because the pressure to get married young and have children young within the group is pretty strong. So there's two ways to look at it, and I'm sure that, and I'm not sure that we know the answer from kind of being on the outside looking in right now on whether it would, and perhaps both situations have happened or do happen, where the man approaches the woman and says, I'm interested, and there is a pressure to say yes. Maybe it's the woman approaches the man and it's reversed, or perhaps there are other influences that come to matchmake that both the husband and the wife together, whether both of them are willing participants or reluctant in that matchmaking process. And then the ceremony is very different to what we might be used to from traditional Christian wedding ceremonies that we see in traditional church settings. And then something else that you mentioned briefly before that is probably worth talking about, because it's another reason this group often finds itself in the headlines, is because of the racist doctrine that they or the racist rhetoric that they do have within their group, or that there are examples of them using in the past. And not just racist in the sense that in the sense of segregation and desegregation within Christian churches throughout the different generations within America, but also the anti-Semitic language that they have used or still continue to use. So I don't know if you had any examples or if you've done any research further into the language that they've used around race and ethnicity.
Yeah, so with the anti-Semitic language that they've used, I don't have a lot on here. I know that they were accused of having a bias against people who are Jewish. But the thing is, there was I think it might have even been by Spriggs himself, because I remember reading a quote somewhere that stated, like, how could we be anti-Semitic? Actually, maybe even on their website, I don't remember, but how could we be anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish when we consider ourselves to be messianic and we follow a lot of the same rituals and traditions that people who are from a Jewish background do, right? But they consider themselves Christians, so they believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Like, they're not still waiting for somebody to come. Like, they believe that Jesus was it and that he's going to return again, which is a little bit different just from a Jewish background, because Christianity has Jesus as that figure who is supposed to, and who has already come and who's coming again. So they claim that is something that doesn't really exist within their communities as a teaching that they ascribe to, because they follow teachings that are Jewish in origin. But so, and I don't know about their stance on this particular thing today when it comes to their idea of slavery and civil rights and the Black community. But there were some teachings that were done in Island Pond, New York, and this was back in 1991, so I was able to find this literature, and there was so much of it. So I'm just gonna name a few examples of what was actually said in the literature. And I think it was an article. It was called Ham, and it was written by somebody or spoken by somebody. I don't have the name of who wrote it. But here's from 1991, Island Pond, Ham's talk on the nations. There is a place outside of the holy city, heaven, where the tribes say they will live to rule over the nations. And this person says, and this is what he's teaching, what a marvelous opportunity that Blacks could be brought over here. So he's talking about New York in the United States, right? He's coming from the United States. How they could be brought over here to America to be slaves so that they could be found worthy of the nations. A good master would work by the sweat of his brow. If his slaves were lazy and disrespectful, he would beat them, which is what he was supposed to do. Now, so this comes from like the story of Noah, and Noah had 3 sons, and Ham was the darker son, and he came from Africa. And this whole teaching makes absolutely no sense to me, because Noah's sons were all from the same mother, right? That apparently Ham was darker and he was to like rule over Africa and he was from Africa, but then the other two went their own different ways. And they weren't sinful like Ham, but how Ham's children were cursed from Africa and they were lucky to now be able to like gain back this status that they could be worthy of the nations. This was another like a quote that was taken from it. They would be worthy of the nations, that they could work on the land and gain their value back, because whites and Noah's other sons were white and they had the power to rule over them. They stated that civil rights was of the world and it messed up the established social order between black and white. And if slaves were mistreated, it was their fault of the slave, like it was the fault of the slave. It was Ham had, it was all because of Ham. For 4,000 years, Israel had slaves. Okay, Ham was a slave. He was black to Shem, the whites. So these are like two separate groups. Like I said, which made no sense at all because they're all from the same parent, but for some reason they're the ones slaves because they're darker and from Africa and the other ones aren't.
It's interesting that it's kind of what I found in an article from The Guardian written in the year 2000, so a while ago now.
Okay.
From somebody called Jeevan Vasaja. And what they've written is kind of in keeping with what you've said. It says a Christian fundamentalist religious movement, which describes Jews as murderers, is using rock festivals, including Glastonbury and Reading, which are two huge festivals over here in the UK, to recruit young people. 12 Tribes, whose 24-hour cafe, The Common Ground, was a popular meeting point at this year's Glastonbury Festival, handed out literature blaming Jewish people for the death of Jesus. One article says, "Murder is the very crime which the Jews are still cursed for." It goes on to speak of the Jews' responsibility for the Messiah's crucifixion. So from what you've said there about the condemnation of certain people within the Bible translates still today, or at least in 2000, with the message that the 12 tribes were proselytizing to potential new recruits or potential new conversions when they go on their recruitment sprees to places like festivals, touring rock bands, and all of that stuff that we've already discussed around the cafe work and everything.
Yeah, and actually I found out about, so I like I said, and I remember hearing about them being like anti-Semitic, but I never like really read articles on it. I just read, I think it was Spriggs' response or one of the elders' response to the fact that they are not, because they follow all of these traditions and everything. But then that person that I was friends with and a coworker with at the health food store that I worked at when I originally found out about them, she was like, yeah, these people are like very racist. And basically what I was saying is that like when I had mentioned this particular, there was an article or a lesson or a teaching. I found the name of it. It's called the Unraveling the Races of Man. And it goes in, this was the 1991, because I have two different dates here. So they were taught at different times, different months of the year. They actually have date stamps on them. But they're teaching, this person is teaching in the 90s, and now I don't know what their view on it is today, because I haven't seen anything about it today, but that their view, or at least this particular person's view in teaching, was that the descendants of Ham and the descendants of Ham from the Old Testament, Noah's son, were cursed by God. And so they needed to submit to their slave masters, who were the whites. And so those people of African origin who were brought to America were given a great opportunity to become slaves so that they could be found worthy of the nations, because this would be their way of giving themselves back to God, because they're working hard in their role. That is their social order, where whites are from Noah's other son Shem, were more worthy and had almost like in Genesis, where man, he rules over woman submits to man. It's kind of the same idea, that within slavery you have the slave and you have the slave master. The slave is black, the slave master is white, in this particular instance where they're talking about in this time of history. And so the slave master has every right to rule over the slave, who is Black African, who was taken over here for purposes of slavery for the white man, because that's the social order that God had given and shown us in the Old Testament by his teachings in the Old Testament. So it's kind of, I think you can probably find this document online. I think I might have a link to that too. If I don't, I'll try to send it to you afterwards. But there are a lot of quotes that I took from it. So,
and from your interpretations or from your literal reading of the Bible, whether that's Old Testament or New Testament, I know that we've said that the 12 tribes are very messianic in their practice, so they probably look more to the Old Testament than the New Testament, right, if it's in keeping with Judaism, or some parts of the Jewish practice. Have you ever read anything in any of the biblical or Bible versions that you've come across where there are examples of white men enslaving black men to further the progress of white men?
No, I have not. No,
much like the spare the rod quote is misinterpreted.
Right. And there are a lot of stories about slavery in the Bible, but they have nothing to do with a person's color and how they interact with one another and
how it's how and how everybody should be adopting the same practices in their everyday life.
Right.
Slavery is good. Come and join in.
Yeah, no. And a lot of the stories that you read in the Old Testament are about how, slaves are going to exist, but you're meant to find that's not going to exist forever, because when you go into the New Testament, there's a passage, there's a line that says there is neither like Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, man or woman, male or female. And I might not be getting that exactly correct, but that's pretty much what it says, that you are all one under Christ Jesus. So if their understanding of the Old Testament, but then they believe in Jesus, then why are they not believing in that New Testament verse that says that there is no slave or free? Like, you're just all, like, no male or female, like, you're just all one under Christ Jesus. You're all the same. And they do have Black members within their communities, not a whole lot, but if you watch some of the YouTube videos, you may see like that there's like one or two members that or a family, a Black family within one or more communities that you may see. Now, in different parts of the world, it may be different, I'm not sure how many within the United States there are, but there aren't a lot. And like I said, I don't know if they have these teachings anymore or if they've changed them, because this was back in 90 and 91. So I don't know if over time their message has changed.
Well, that article from the Glastonbury Festival was 2000.
Oh, that was 2000, right? Yeah. So that
perhaps
was
even from 2000 to today, maybe it's changed.
Maybe it's changed, yeah.
But so, in a lot of the stuff that I have watched or read, where the 12 tribes leadership has been accused of being racist or having racist doctrine or rhetoric, they are so quick to say, but we have people within the community that are right. Persons of color.
Yeah.
But that doesn't, just because there are members within the group that are not white in skin color doesn't mean that you're not racist.
Right.
So and much in the same way that Spriggs was so quick to talk about how they pay property taxes and that's why they shouldn't be investigated for child abuse. Right. It just because you pay property taxes, like most hardworking, lawful people pay their taxes anyway, doesn't mean that you're not abusing children.
One has nothing to do with the other.
So the last few points that I have to go over that I wondered if you could shed any light on are the scandals that have landed the 12 tribes into the hot water, to court cases, to news articles coming out about them. I've got written here Germany and the community in Germany that came under investigation. So they upped and left and moved over to the Czech Republic because the child labour laws are less severe. Or the child labour laws are lacking in the Czech Republic, so they kind of just upped and rebranded. So I didn't know if you had any more information about that particular incident. And then there was the recent fire that we mentioned at the start of the episode that has been linked back to the 12 tribes and one particular community that has been accused of having a hand in causing that fire. And anything else that you think might be notable to mention before we end our episode today?
Yeah, so I could start off with the Germany. Like, I don't have a lot of information about Germany. I just know in 2013, there was a police raid and it removed 40 children from the community after there was some undercover footage captured of repeated child abuse. But then the children were returned, I think. And then I never read any more about that particular story. There's another one that goes back to 1984. So this is a little bit older, and then I'll bring the most recent one up. This is really short, but in Island Pond, New York, which is the same place where I was telling you about the more racist teachings that happened in 91, there were some police that were carrying affidavits reporting child beatings of 100. So 112 children were taken from their home by the police because the police confiscated a lot of rods that were found around the home that were used for punishment of the children. But because the judge wasn't ruling on that particular child abuse, they declared that the search was illegal and they released the children back to the community. So, right. And I don't know what happened after that. I think it was just done. But then there was that, particular Marshall Fire that actually I have family that lives like not that far away from there, which is so crazy. So the Marshall Fire at El Dorado Springs Drive, firefighters were called to a trash fire that was being burned on the 12 Tribes compound days before that actual huge fire took place. And this was more recent. So this is the most recent, I think, controversy that there has been concerning this group. But the trash burning in the area that they are in was considered legal. But because it was so dry and windy that day, it probably wasn't the best time to be burning your trash or whatever they were burning. And a passerby that was driving, like just driving by the area, took video footage of it and sent it to the police saying, like, you might want to check this out because it's really dry and windy out. And there's this like crazy fire going on. And this was on, I think it was like left unattended on Christmas Eve. And then there was an investigation done by Mountain View Fire Rescue. And they didn't extinguish the fire because it was considered legal to burn on your property. But in like the county, and I think it was, or no, in Boulder, I don't know if it's the county line or the town line of Boulder, Colorado. I don't know if there's a county of Boulder or if it's just the town. But in Boulder, which is like right there, on days that it's extremely windy or dry, you're not allowed to have, there's like a burn ban on everything. Like you can't burn anything because it could cause wildfires. But because they weren't over that county or that town line, whichever it was, and I'm sorry that I can't tell you which one it is, it didn't count as being an illegal activity. So, but there was a shed that was also on fire that was burning on their property. Whether they did it on purpose, it seems that they did, because they like dug a trench line around the entire thing to keep it from like going over. But this fire destroyed 1,000 homes. It burned 6,000 acres, I'm sorry, in Superior, Louisville, I think. Oh, in Boulder County. So it is Boulder County. One man was killed. One woman was reported missing. I don't know if any more people were found to be missing or killed in this fire, but it destroyed like a few entire towns. And they had a burn expert, like a fire rescue, some kind of expert on like studying from a drone, studying the site. And she said it's possible that if and people were burning like railroad ties. So there was like a fire marshal on there as well. And railroad ties are humongous. Like they're huge. I don't know if you know like how big railroad ties can be, but they're humongous. But they were being burned, and the fire marshal said for railroad ties, those, I don't think they were burned on the same day, but they might have been burned around that time. They have creosote on them, which makes them highly flammable. So they could just burn ongoing forever and ever and ever until you put the fire out, because it's like never cleaning out your chimney and then your house catches on fire because you never had your chimney cleaned because the creosote builds up. But they also said that it's possible that the fire could have spread underground and gotten to a tree root and actually burned up through the ground up into the trees that way as well. And they're pretty sure that it all started with this community, that but they weren't considered to be doing anything illegal because of the law within that town. But the fact that they were doing it on a day that was like really dry and windy, that was not really a good choice. And also they were called to that community many, many times before for other abuses that were done. So there was that. And then there was one more with Zarnecki, who was one of the elders that was under Spriggs, who was, I think it was 2021, January of 2021. He was just in his house, and like doing whatever he was doing in his house. And a 17-year-old boy who was part of the 12 tribes community, because Zarnecki left the community as an elder. He no longer lived with the community and he spoke out against them. And a few months later, he was killed in a fire that was set by 12 tribes member. And the member was charged with murder, improperly interfering with a corpse, and malicious damage by fire. And this was also 2 months after the police launched the investigation into the accusations of the high stillbirths and possible grave sites on the compounds in Australia. This was in Australia. So that's some of the crazy news that came out about these people recently.
There's a few things that keep kind of bringing the group back into the public eye. And the fire, I feel like perhaps that could have happened on any homestead or farm or community.
Sure.
In those kind of conditions or in that environment, if there was a fire on the property, whether it was controlled or not, that kind of spiraled out of control and caused such devastation and tragedy in its wake. And
right.
I'm sure that whoever was responsible for lighting the fire that day, or whoever was involved in that event taking place, carries that with them. So I don't think that there was any malicious intent around having the fire on the property that day.
No.
But it is an example of why the group was brought back into the spotlight of many different media outlets, not just within the US, but around the world, in places where there have been court cases and legal issues surrounding the group. And of course, with every headline that comes out, there'll be all of the other things that come with it, much like the Glastonbury article we were reading before about how the propaganda was being spread around the festival. In that news article includes historic messages and rhetoric that the group have been known to spread throughout the world before that Glastonbury festival. So every time the group re-enters the headlines, it brings with it all of the historic court cases and problematic issues that the group have become known for. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because all of the information, as long as it is factual and accurate, that is brought into the public attention, means that we can better equip ourselves and understand things and know what a Yellow Deli is, and who might be serving us if we decide to go in there and eat. But there are other things that have happened, like the 17-year-old going to take the life of an ex-member who has decided to bravely speak out against the group and the types of abuses that take place. Somebody that may have been able to provide key evidence in court cases that go to, or legal cases that go to look at the high rates of stillborn or unborn babies, and unmarked grave sites that have found to that are later found to belong to other unborn babies or young babies that didn't live to grow into adulthood. So that is something that I'm sure now will become a staple part of future news articles that come out about the 12 tribes, when more things come forward about this practicing child abuse that takes place within the high demand religious group. Hopefully, as more and more people manage to find their way out and less people find their way in, but maybe that's just me having wishful thinking. So as we mentioned before, we will list all of the sources that we have used today in this episode, so that people can go and corroborate anything that we've said, because we're coming at it from an outside perspective, not from a lived experience or survivor story like we often do on the show. But before we finish today, there is something that I wanted to mention, and that is the fact that you, Sarah, do have your own podcast.
I do. It might not be as good as yours. It's just started. I'm just doing it for fun. It's more of a history-based podcast, and I have another one coming out too that's unlike sort of like crunchy, not related to 12 Tribes Crunchy Hippie, but like Crunchy Hippie kind of like home related lifestyle stuff, which I'm in the process of making the first episode, and I don't have a name for it yet. So maybe later on that could come. But my podcast that I'm working on right now, it's called The Varieties of History. And you could get it on Spotify. And I think you could just go on to Anchor FM. I'm really bad with this. AnchorFM.com and maybe find it on there. And I'm on Facebook at The Varieties of History. So I'm on Pinterest too. I don't do Instagram. I don't do Twitter. I haven't started YouTube yet. It's like way too many things, and I don't have a lot of time for even just making the podcast. But the podcast is more like quirky, fun kind of history. So I'm like wearing a macaroni and cheese shirt right now, and I did one on like the history of macaroni and cheese. I did one on like the history of potato chips and the Hers Potato Chip Factory, which is 10 minutes from my house. I did another one on sacred harp singing. I'll be doing like ones on states that never existed. For each state that never existed, I'll like do different information about each one on each episode. I'm only on episode 4 or 5 right now, so it's like really, really early. But I can't wait for you to come on. We got to talk about some cool stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm really excited. I mean, if anybody is interested in listening to Sarah's podcast, Sarah has a master's degree in the studies of the early American history, or the early history of America. So obviously very good at understanding the importance of correct research and citing the correct source material, as we've kind of heard in today's episode. But hopefully, if people are going through the back catalogue, then there'll be a few more episodes out by the time that people stumble across this episode. So that's the Varieties of History podcast. And I will find the Anchor FM link for that podcast and put that also in the episode description. So if anybody wants to go and check that out, or have a subscribe, or leave a little review or rating, or anything that will help to push Sarah's show through the algorithm, then we would really appreciate that today. And if there's anything that you think that I can help you with around the history of, I think I said there's not really many things that I know too much about, other than the kind of the birth and life of maybe the Beatles, just because I'm of where I studied university and where I've lived for the last 10 years over in Liverpool. So anything that you think of that I might be able to help with, I'd love to be able to come on your show and hopefully bring one or two of my listeners over to your show to have a little listen. So thank you so much, Sarah, for all of your research, for coming to me, and for being a listener of the show, and for being willing to come over to my podcast today to sit down and talk with me, and to bring this new topic around the 12 tribes to the podcast, which is something that has been so highly requested. Every time I say, does anybody have a request? There's always somebody that says, look at the 12 tribes, please cover the 12 tribes. Have you spoken about the 12 tribes? So now we've done that with your help. Awesome. And thank you so much for coming here and just having this lengthy dialogue with me today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me on. I'm really excited to hear it when it comes out. And I love this podcast so much. So I hope people find an interest in this group, because they are very interesting. and they are
everywhere.
Yeah. Oh, they're everywhere. Yeah. So, but yeah, thank you so much for having me on. This is an awesome time.
It's absolutely been such an honor of mine, Sarah. Enjoy the rest of your day. I'll speak to you soon.
All right. Thank you.
Take care.
Too.
Bye.
Bye.
That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com, or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, And this has been the Cult Vault.